Welcome to Wealthrise Stories, where clarity meets knowledge, and knowledge becomes financial power.
Have you ever asked yourself Latin America? Is it a continent or is it a product? It sounds strange, doesn't it? But try closing your eyes for a moment. Really just close them for 1 second. What shows up in your mind when you hear the phrase Latin America? Is it endless stretches of powder-white beaches, turquoise waves crashing gently under the golden glow of a late afternoon sun? Or is it the fiery rhythms of salsa and samba, the explosion of colors during carnival, the bright smiles of warm, welcoming people holding a tropical cocktail in hand? Yes, all of those images are real. We see them every day in glossy travel ads, in vibrant music videos, in colorful Hollywood films, and even on the covers of upscale magazines. We are sold a dream of Latin America, an earthly paradise, a land of joy, wild beauty, and endless adventure. But is that the whole story? Have you ever paused for a moment and wondered what sits behind that polished surface? Have you ever questioned why, if Latin America is only beaches and dance, its history is filled with upheavals, revolutions, coups, and deep social struggles, things you'll never find in a travel brochure? So when you hear Latin America, do you think of fiery dances and postcard-perfect beaches? Or do you sense a far more complicated story hiding underneath shaped, filtered, and sold to the world in a very particular way? The truth is, this isn't a new question. It's been asked quietly for a very long time. And the answers, often unspoken, have shown up through the actions of those in power. You know, in a speech from the early 20th century when Western powers were expanding their reach across the globe, a prominent politician once made a rather biting remark, and allow me to quote it here with a touch of irony. Latin America isn't just a land of opportunity. It's a market full of potential, as long as we know how to shape it and sell it to the right buyers. Cold, isn't it? A perspective so transactional, it practically reduces an entire region, its people, its cultures, its civilizations, into a commodity. Yet this is precisely the core of the book we're going to connect with today. Selling Latin America, a problem in international salesmanship. This book isn't just a title, it's a statement. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. For centuries, Latin America hasn't been treated merely as a group of nations, peoples, and cultures. It has been turned into a product. A product with a price tag, a packaging strategy, a marketing campaign, and a global distribution plan we might never have imagined. From the earliest missionaries to giant corporate conglomerates, from government agendas to billion-dollar tourism campaigns, everyone has played a part in this massive deal. And like any business transaction, there are always beneficiaries, and there are always those who pay the price. In this part of the Connect, we're not just exploring how a continent became a commodity and how its image was manipulated. The bigger question we're going to uncover today is who actually bought this product and who ended up paying the cost with their history, their culture, their resources, and even their future. Let's dive into this complex, sometimes painful, sometimes deeply inspiring story together. Are you ready? Welcome back to the channel. I know sometimes when we look at a world map or skim through the news, it feels like an invisible curtain is covering the real stories, the living souls behind the headlines, behind all those cold, lifeless numbers. Today we're going to pull that curtain back. And our destination is a place bursting with color contradictions and stories that have been told poorly. Latin America. Latin. When you think of Latin America, what pops into your mind? Maybe the fiery rhythms of salsa, sun-soaked beaches in the Caribbean, the majestic ruins of the Inca, or the endless stretch of the Amazon rainforest. Or perhaps what surfaces are the stories about drugs, political turmoil, poverty, and coups, the ones you've seen splashed across front pages. Whatever you imagine, whether it's beautiful or bleak, one thing is certain: it's a brand. A brand that has been built, shaped, and at times strategically sold to the world. And the interesting thing is, this idea of selling Latin America isn't new at all. In fact, it was examined long ago in the book we're exploring today, Selling Latin America: A Problem in International Salesmanship by James R. Curtis. Even though it was written in the mid-20th century, the book remains strikingly relevant, maybe even more urgent in an era of globalization and information warfare. It isn't just a historical text. It's a mirror reflecting how we and the world have perceived, packaged, and projected cultures and nations. The title, Selling Latin America, might sound a little academic, maybe even dry, right? Definitely not something you'd pick up while lounging on a beach. A soft chuckle. But trust me, this isn't a boring history lecture. On this channel, you know we don't just read books. We read the stories, the experiences, the human spirits woven into every page. For me, studying a book like this isn't just about absorbing knowledge. It's an act of cultural empathy. A journey where we try to understand the choices, the motivations, and the consequences that economic and political strategies have carved into real human lives. Because at its core, history isn't a collection of dry events. It's the sum of billions of intertwined individual stories. This is a conversation about how stories, whether carefully crafted identities or distorted, forgotten voices, have shaped the destinies of millions. It's not just about Latin America. It's about how we define the world and the people living in it. Think about it, a vast continent rich in culture and overflowing with history, packaged and sold like a product. It sounds absurd, but it's something that has happened and is still happening. The images, the narratives we absorb every day about Latin America, where do they come from, who creates them, and more importantly, what purpose do they serve? So, what's our goal on this journey? Together, we'll peel back the templates and stereotypes built by international media, political strategy, and even the tourism industry. We're going to ask questions, uncomfortable ones, and challenge the things we assumed were true. We're going to listen to the forgotten voices, the genuine stories of Latin Americans, people who have lived, loved, and struggled under the long shadow of that massive brand. From coffee farmers in Colombia to street artists in Buenos Aires, to environmental activists in the Amazon. Each of them carries a crucial piece of the puzzle we need to see the fuller, truer picture. And most importantly, we'll look at the real impact of selling a culture or a people. It's not just economic or political. It runs straight into identity and the human spirit. How has being labeled, boxed in, and reduced to narrow definitions changed the way they see themselves and the way they interact with the world? This isn't just a quick overview. This is an invitation to go deeper with me beyond what we usually see in sensational headlines or on glossy travel postcards. We won't stay on the surface. We'll push into the deeper layers of truth, emotion, and personal experience. Picture this. We're sitting in a tiny cafe in Bogota or strolling through the old streets of Cusco, listening to the whispered stories of both past and present. Together, we'll break down how a single idea, a single image can become a powerful tool, one that shapes the world's perception of a region, and more importantly, shapes the way the people of that region are seen. I believe that after this video, you'll look at Latin America and how we look at the world in general with a new lens, a more empathetic, more nuanced lens. You'll see that every brand carries a story, and sometimes that story needs to be told again, truthfully. So are you ready? Let's peel back the Latin America brand and explore what lies beneath it. We're starting right now. Today we're kicking off a fascinating journey, diving into a book with a very provocative title, Selling Latin America: A Problem in International Salesmanship. Sounds strange, doesn't it? How can you sell an entire continent? But trust me, this isn't about buying and selling ordinary goods. This is a story about selling an idea, a narrative, a destiny for an entire region. And it starts a long time ago, back in the early days of what people called the New World. We're going to explore Chapter 1, The First Salesman. From Columbus to the Monroe Doctrine. The goal of this chapter is to trace the historical roots of selling Latin America, from the tales spun by European colonizers to the early foreign policy of the United States that framed the region as a place that needed to be developed and guided. Enar 1. Columbus and the story of the New World. When resources were sold through storytelling. Let's roll back time to the late 15th century when Christopher Columbus first set foot in the Americas. Most of us were taught that he discovered a new world. But think about it a little more. Did he really discover it, or did he create a story about it? When Columbus returned to Europe, his reports weren't just dry geographic descriptions. They were pitches, embellished persuasive accounts that sold an image of the New World as a wild, untouched land, overflowing with wealth, rich in gold and silver, and most importantly, unclaimed. That story became the foundation for everything that followed. Picture this. You're a king or queen in Europe at the time, struggling with tight budgets and hungry for more power. Then a man shows up and paints a vivid picture of lush islands, visible veins of gold and silver, and naive native people just waiting to be civilized and turned into labor. Sounds tempting, doesn't it? This was the moment when the story of the New World was crafted to legitimize the extraction of resources. Terra nullius. Nobody's land became a legal concept Europeans applied, even though millions of indigenous people had been living there for thousands of years. Brilliant civilizations like the Aztec, Maya, and Inca were downgraded to savages, pagans in need of salvation. That narrative didn't just justify the looting of gold, silver, and minerals. It also justified land grabs, enslavement of indigenous peoples, and the spread of their religion. The essence of the art of selling here wasn't about selling a product. It was about selling a reason, a justification for their actions. They sold themselves and the world on the idea that conquest and exploitation were not only acceptable, but noble, bringing civilization and light to dark lands. This was the very first brick laid in shaping Latin America as a place that needed to be explored and led by outside powers. 2. The Monroe Doctrine, America's contradictory protector. Fast forward to the early 19th century. The nations of Latin America had just won their independence from Spain and Portugal after decades of bloody wars. But as one door closed, another opened, bringing in a new salesman with a different product, the United States. In 1823, President James Monroe announced the Monroe Doctrine. In simple terms, it declared that European powers were no longer allowed to interfere in the affairs of newly independent countries in the Western Hemisphere. Sounds noble, right? A pledge to protect young nations from being recolonized by the old empires. But in reality, it was a declaration of U.S. dominance in the region. It was like an older brother saying to the rest of the world, "No one gets to push my little siblings around except me." The U.S. cast itself as a protector, while quietly claiming exclusive rights to influence the political and economic future of Latin America. This created a deeply contradictory role. On one hand, the Monroe Doctrine was presented as a shield. On the other, it laid the groundwork for American intervention in the region, often under the banner of protecting interests or maintaining stability. The U.S. sold the world and itself an image of Latin America as a region that needed supervision, a backyard that had to be guided, so it wouldn't fall into the hands of rival powers. It reinforced the idea that Latin American countries weren't fully capable of self-governance and needed a strong hand from the North to keep things in order. 3. Mexico and Manifest Destiny, a nation's image distorted for foreign gain. To see even more clearly how a country's image can be distorted for outside gain during this period, let's look at Mexico in the mid-19th century. Mexico was a huge country rich in resources, but after winning independence, it faced serious internal problems, weak governments, factional conflicts, and uprisings. That's the historical reality. But this reality was cleverly twisted and exploited by the United States for its own benefit. In the 1830s and 1840s, the concept of manifest destiny became popular in the U.S. The belief that America had a God-given right and duty to expand its territory and spread its version of democracy across the North American continent. To legitimize expansion into the Southwest, especially the annexation of Texas in the Mexican-American War, a powerful narrative was pushed. Mexico was portrayed as chaotic, backward, and incapable of managing its vast lands. Mexicans were depicted as unable to develop their resources, maintain order, or even control their own fate. Huge territories, including what is now California, New Mexico, and Arizona, lands rich in minerals and strategically located, were painted as wasted wilderness that needed a more civilized hand to unlock their potential. And so the Mexican-American War happened. The U.S. bought Louisiana and Florida. But when it came to Mexico, it sold the public a justification to seize land. The result, Mexico lost more than half of its territory. This is a painful example of how the image of a nation was deliberately distorted, not just to justify invasion, but to create the perception that Latin America's internal weakness was the reason foreign intervention and control were necessary. 4. Connecting the early ideas to later policies. What's important to understand is that these early ideas didn't just stay locked in history books. They created a template, a mental and moral framework that shaped how great powers, especially the United States, viewed and treated Latin America for centuries afterward. The notion that Latin America is a region that needs to be developed, needs guidance, is unstable or incapable of true self-rule, became the foundation for many later interventions. From backing pro-U.S. dictatorships during the Cold War to fight communism, a modern version of bringing civilization to barbarians, to economic manipulation through multinational corporations that helped create banana republics, to direct military interventions to protect interests. All of it carried the fingerprints of narratives first sold in the era of Columbus and the Monroe Doctrine, even as the packaging changed from civilizing the savages to spreading freedom and democracy or fighting terrorism. The core story stayed the same. Latin America was portrayed as unable to stand firmly on its own, in need of guardianship and correction from the outside. The first salesman succeeded in creating an image, a perception whose consequences we're still dealing with today. So we've just dug into Chapter 1, The First Salesman. From Columbus to the Monroe Doctrine, we've seen how the story of the New World was crafted to legitimize exploitation, how the Monroe Doctrine created a contradictory protector role for the United States, and how the image of countries like Mexico was deliberately distorted to serve foreign interests. These ideas, even though they may feel distant in time, form the solid groundwork for how Latin America has been sold. Not as a commodity, but as an idea, a destiny throughout history. In the previous chapter, we explored the early attempts of Latin American nations to shape their own image, attempts that more often than not struggled to gain traction. They fought for respect, for recognition, instead of being seen as nothing more than wild, exotic lands through the Western lens. Today we're diving into a completely different dimension of selling oneself, but this time, the sellers aren't nations. They're multinational giants, corporations that turned beautiful lands into their private playgrounds and entire populations into suppliers of raw materials. Welcome to Chapter 2, The Banana Product and the friendly republics. Have you ever wondered, while holding a perfectly ripe sweet banana in your hand, what journey it took to get to you? Sounds harmless, right? Just a tropical fruit, healthy, simple. But behind that cheerful yellow peel lies a complex and at times brutal history of power, profit, and political intervention that most people never imagine. 1. The origin and meaning of the term Banana Republic. Banana Republic. Chances are you've heard the term before. It sounds almost playful, but it carries sharp criticism beneath the surface. The phrase was coined by the American writer O. Henry in the early 20th century when he described a fictional country called Anchuria in his book Cabbages and Kings, and the term was painfully accurate. So what exactly is a banana republic? It's a small country, usually in Central America or the Caribbean, whose economy is heavily dependent on exporting a single cash crop, in this case, bananas. Along with this economic dependence comes a weak, corrupt government, one easily manipulated by massive foreign corporations that pull the real strings behind the scenes. These companies control everything: land, railroads, ports, politics, and even the military. And when we talk about banana republics, one name towers above all others: the United Fruit Company, UFC. A name that sounds sweet and harmless, but the power it wielded was anything but. 2. Advertising and PR. Turning nations into raw material suppliers. UFC didn't just sell bananas. They sold an entire dream. Think back to the early 20th century when most Americans had never even seen a fresh banana. UFC launched a marketing campaign so masterful that it didn't just promote the fruit, it romanticized the tropical lands where bananas grew. They framed Central American countries as sun-soaked paradises, exotic, untouched, blissful places where cheerful locals plucked fruit for the civilized world. You probably remember the iconic Chiquita banana girl with her fruit-laden hat, always singing and dancing. That image wasn't just for fun, it was crafted to comfort consumers to gloss over the reality of what was happening in the producing countries. UFC's PR campaigns excelled at reducing entire nations into nothing more than extensions of their supply chain. They didn't want people thinking about the political tension, the economic instability, or the living conditions of workers in Honduras, Guatemala, or Costa Rica. What they wanted was to sell bananas, and to do that they needed a simple, appealing image and a reliable source of raw materials. And they succeeded in creating a velvet curtain that hid the harsh truth, the exploitation of labor land and resources. 3. Political and military intervention to protect corporate interests. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. The true power of the United Fruit Company and corporations like it lay in their ability to interfere directly and deeply in the politics of the countries they operated in. Whenever profits were threatened, they used every tool at their disposal. UFC owned vast networks, ships, the Great White Fleet, railroads, ports, telephone lines, telegraph systems, sometimes more modern and efficient than what the local governments had. That gave them immense leverage. They bankrolled friendly politicians, bribed officials, and even backed coups to overthrow uncooperative governments. And when needed, they lobbied aggressively in Washington, D.C., convincing the U.S. government that their corporate interests were national interests. More than once, this led to direct U.S. military intervention in the region, often justified as protecting American citizens or fighting the communist threat, a highly effective excuse during the Cold War. This wasn't an invisible hand. It was a very visible one, powerful, forceful, and holding the fate of entire nations in its grip. 4. The story of a corporate-backed coup, Guatemala, 1954. To illustrate this even more clearly, let's look at a classic example, Guatemala, 1954. After decades under U.S.-friendly dictatorships, Guatemala experienced a brief period of democracy. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was elected president on a platform promising land reform to help hundreds of thousands of landless farmers. His plan was to purchase large, uncultivated estates from private landowners and redistribute them to poor peasants. Sounds progressive, right? But there was one enormous problem. The United Fruit Company was the biggest landowner in Guatemala, holding over 200,000 acres, much of it unused. When Arbenz proposed buying unused UFC land at the value the company itself had declared for tax purposes, which, as you might guess, was extremely low, UFC was furious. They launched a massive lobbying and propaganda campaign in the United States. UFC hired top-tier PR gurus, powerful lawyers, and leveraged every connection it had in the U.S. government. Many high-ranking officials had close ties to UFC Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, had been their lawyer, and CIA Director Alan Dulles had held shares in the company. UFC painted a terrifying picture of Guatemala, a communist beachhead just south of the U.S. border threatening regional security. Never mind that Arbenz wasn't a communist, and that his land reform was a democratic effort to improve living conditions. Washington bought the story, and in 1954, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. They trained and armed a small rebel force led by an exiled military officer to overthrow Arbenz. Alongside this, they waged psychological warfare radio broadcasts, disinformation fear campaigns. Arbenz, abandoned by the U.S., was forced to resign. He fled the country, leaving Guatemala spiraling into political chaos and decades of violent U.S.-backed military dictatorships. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed or disappeared in the civil war that followed. All of this over bananas and the profits of one corporation. The story of the United Fruit Company and the Banana Republics is a powerful reminder that international business isn't just about goods and services. It's about power, about shaping images, and sometimes about determining the fate of entire nations. What we see on supermarket shelves, the bright yellow bananas, is the end product of a global supply chain that at one point in history triggered coups, political interference, and bitter struggles for justice. The next time you hold a banana, I hope you'll remember this story. Remember that every product has a history, and that history isn't always as sweet as it tastes. In the next chapter, we'll explore another side of selling oneself, when indigenous communities try to reclaim and reshape their own image through culture, art, and tourism. The question is, can they escape the long shadow of the banana republics and truly take ownership of their narrative? We're continuing our journey through Selling Latin America, a problem in international salesmanship, a book that isn't just an economic or political analysis, but a story about how ideas, images, and even fears have been marketed like products shaping an entire region. In the previous chapters, we talked about how the United States tried to sell its image as a friend, a partner, and how it attempted to shape markets and culture in Latin America. But today, we're stepping into a heavier chapter 1 I believe every one of us needs to confront. This is chapter 3, Selling Security, the Cold War Crusade against Communism. Imagine this. You're living in your home, and someone knocks on your door telling you there's a monster lurking somewhere outside threatening your peace. They offer to sell you a special security system, perhaps even ask to enter your house to protect you. In return, you may have to give up some privacy, some freedom. But they promise it's all for your safety. Sound familiar? That is precisely the story the U.S. sold to Latin America throughout the Cold War. A righteous crusade against communism, a threat painted in terrifying colors, often brushing aside basic human rights and democratic principles. They weren't just selling military protection. They were selling an idea of fear. 1. The propaganda campaigns, turning social movements into communism. The Cold War was an era where ideological confrontation reached its peak. To the United States, any social movement in Latin America, whether it was calling for land reform, labor rights, or resisting exploitation by foreign corporations, could easily be labeled communist. Picture it, US-backed propaganda across the region painted a distorted, monstrous image of communism. It wasn't just a political system. It was a creature that would destroy families, religion, private property, and every value Latin Americans held dear. Radio stations, newspapers, films, school materials, every medium became a tool to amplify this fear. When farmers in Guatemala simply wanted a small piece of land to cultivate. When miners and factory workers in Chile demanded fair wages. When students in Peru protested against corruption, all of them could be portrayed as puppets of Moscow or Havana conspirators plotting to bring chaos and oppression. The domino theory became gospel. If one nation fell to communism, the entire region would collapse. And just like that, selling security became a convenient excuse for intervention. 2. US-backed coups, from rhetoric to action. And then the rhetoric turned into action. The US didn't stop at propaganda. It converted selling security into military interventions and bloody coups. Take Guatemala, 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was democratically elected. He pursued land reforms, reclaiming unused land from giant corporations like the US-based United Fruit Company to help poor farmers. This wasn't communism. It was a democratic attempt to improve people's lives. But Washington quickly branded him a communist. The CIA orchestrated a coup overthrowing Arbenz and installing a brutal military regime, plunging the country into decades of repression and civil war, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Then there's Chile, 1973. Salvador Allende, a socialist, yes, but one who was legally and democratically elected. He nationalized core industries like copper mining, which had long been dominated by American corporations. To Washington, this was unacceptable. The Nixon administration secretly supported a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet. Allende died that day, and Chile entered 17 years of dictatorship, marked by torture killings and disappearances. And it didn't stop there. Brazil, 1964, Argentina, 1976, Nicaragua, and more. Wherever a democratic government or a social movement threatened U.S. interests, the U.S. stepped in, turning security into suppression. These coups didn't bring safety to the people. They brought instability, fear, and loss. 3. Voices from the shadows, life under U.S.-backed dictatorships. Here is where the story becomes most heartbreaking. Set aside the statistics and political theories for a moment. Try stepping into the shoes of an ordinary person living under a U.S.-backed dictatorship. I've often wondered, what did the so-called security sold by the U.S. actually mean for them? For them, what did safety look like? It meant constant fear. A knock on the door at midnight could be a death sentence. Silence became a survival tactic because you never knew who was listening or who might report you. Loved ones disappeared without a trace, and you couldn't ask questions. Imagine being a student in Chile after 1973. Your dream of a fair, free society is crushed. Your professors, your friends are arrested. Books are burned. Freedom of speech and assembly become distant concepts. You live in safety, protected by a government the U.S. calls an ally. But to you, it's a prison without walls. Or imagine a mother in Guatemala. Your husband, a farmer, disappears simply because he joined a group advocating for land reform. You know what happened, but you can't speak about it. You raise your children in a society divided by fear, where brutality becomes normal. And security is an empty word, a lie sold by those in power. This is the human lens I want to bring into the story. This isn't just history, it's shattered lives, scars that never heal. The cost of security was the loss of dignity, freedom, and life itself. 4. Revealing the truth. Security for whom benefits for whom. So ultimately, who was this security really for? And what was hiding behind the bright anti-communist curtain? Behind that curtain lay massive American economic interests. U.S. corporations had deep stakes throughout Latin America, from United Fruit's banana plantations in Central America to copper mining and Chile oil in Venezuela, and factories relying on cheap labor across the region. Social movements and democratic governments often threatened these interests. Land reform could strip corporations of their estates. Nationalizing natural resources could cut off huge profit streams. Demands for better wages and working conditions could weaken corporate competitiveness. So selling security wasn't just an ideological mission, it was a shrewd business strategy. By labeling anyone who challenged their economic interests as communist, the U.S. legitimized intervention, toppled democratic governments, and supported dictatorships willing to protect American corporate power. The stability they sold wasn't for Latin American citizens, it was stability for U.S. business operations. My friends, Chapter 3 is a heavy one. It exposes a painful part of history where noble ideals like democracy and freedom were twisted and weaponized to serve political and economic agendas. The U.S. sold a solution to a problem it had largely exaggerated, or in some cases helped create. And the price was paid in blood, tears, and decades of repression for the people of Latin America. This doesn't mean we deny the real threat of communism in that historical context. But it does force us to question the humanity and morality of how a superpower acted. The security that was sold wasn't meant for those who needed it most. It was meant to preserve an order that benefited the seller. In the next chapter, we'll continue digging into the ways powerful nations have shaped and continue to shape the world we live in. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our series on Selling Latin America, a Problem in International Salesmanship. In the previous chapters, we've dug into the ways Latin American countries have been packaged and sold to the Western world through different lenses, from lands of abundant resources to backdrops for wild adventure. But today, we're going to open up another angle, one that's probably the most relatable and alluring for many of us, turning Latin America into a tourist paradise. Who doesn't dream of golden sunshine, white sand, turquoise water, and a cold cocktail by an infinity pool, right? That is exactly the image that has been marketed to us for decades. But is that paradise really the full picture? Or is it just a glossy coat of paint covering some very dark corners of reality? Chapter 4. The Tourism Paradise. Packaging sun, sand, and smiles will help us search for the answer. Let's roll back the clock for a moment. When international tourism started booming, Latin America was quickly positioned as an exotic, wild, yet conveniently safe destination for Western travelers. Early promotional campaigns were incredibly skilled at painting a picture of a continent full of mysteries waiting to be discovered, ancient temples hidden in deep jungles, energetic indigenous dances, untouched beaches where no one had set foot. All of it wrapped neatly in one keyword: exoticism, the deliberate making of something strange and other. They weren't just selling a trip. They were selling a dream. A dream of escape from everyday life, of immersing oneself in a completely different culture, but within a controlled environment. Ad posters showed smiling locals in bright traditional costumes, welcoming visitors with open arms. The scenery was always perfect: gently curved palm trees, fiery sunsets, and calm rolling waves. The problem is, those images were usually cut off from the complex social, political, and economic realities of those places. Local people are not actors in an ad campaign. They are real human beings with real struggles. And then, to make that dream come true while still keeping everything under control, a new model appeared: isolated tourist zones, also known as enclaves. Think of the all-inclusive resorts in Cancun, Mexico, or Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. They're designed as self-contained little worlds, sealed off from their surroundings. Inside those fortified perimeters, tourists enjoy every imaginable amenity: pools, restaurants, bars, spas, entertainment. They can easily spend an entire week there without ever setting foot outside. What's the purpose of these oases? On one level, it's about maximum safety and comfort for Western visitors who are willing to pay to avoid any discomfort or perceived danger. But on another, and perhaps more important level, it's a way to hide the harsh reality of poverty and inequality that exists just beyond the resort gates. Visitors from wealthy, stable countries often don't want to see slums, muddy roads, or locals struggling to make ends meet just a few miles away. Those images could shatter the illusion of paradise and create discomfort. So the resorts function as a curtain, creating a tourism bubble where everything is curated to meet the expectations of the guest. Local people who work incredibly hard to keep that machine running mostly appear in service roles, then vanish at the end of their shifts, returning to their own world, a world that looks nothing like the one inside the resort. But is this mass tourism growth really the economic miracle it's often advertised to be? Behind the smiles of hotel staff and the glamour of luxury resorts are some undeniable downsides. First, labor. Tourism has certainly created thousands of jobs for local communities. But at what wage? In many cases, these are low-paying jobs, physically demanding, with limited opportunities for advancement. Workers often endure harsh conditions and long hours far from their families, all to sustain someone else's vacation. It becomes a vicious cycle of economic dependence, where local communities lean heavily on an industry that is extremely vulnerable to outside shocks like economic recessions or global pandemics. Second, the environmental impact. Mega resorts consume massive amounts of resources: fresh water for pools and golf courses, electricity for air conditioning, and lights, imported foods to cater to diverse tourist tastes. Wastewater and trash from thousands of tourists a day put enormous strain on local infrastructure, which is often underdeveloped. Coastal ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves, the very gems that attract visitors, are increasingly threatened by pollution and unplanned development. Finally, and perhaps most sadly, there's cultural erosion. When culture becomes a product to be sold to tourists, it's easily simplified, commercialized, and even distorted. Traditional dances get performed nightly as entertainment. Handcrafted goods are mass-produced in factories instead of by artisans, and sacred festivals become staged events for tourist consumption. Authentic cultural identity slowly loses its depth and sacred meaning, replaced by a watered-down, more digestible version. To see this contrast more clearly, let's look at a specific example. Cancun, Mexico. This name is almost synonymous with tourist paradise in Latin America. The images used to promote Cancun are always the same powdery white sand, like sugar crystal clear turquoise water, where you can see the ocean floor gleaming five-star resorts under the blazing sun and world-class service. It's marketed as the ultimate escape, where you can completely unplug from your worries. But what does reality look like? Cancun was planned in the early 1970s by the Mexican government to become a major tourist hub. The Zona Hotelera Hotel Zone is a long, narrow strip of land shaped like a number 7, where most of the luxury resorts and hotels are concentrated. Across the bridge inland lies the real city of Cancun, where hundreds of thousands of locals live and work. The contrast is striking. While the hotel zone glows with lights and thumps with nightlife, neighborhoods like Alfredo Fi Bonfil and various colonias, informal settlements, struggle with poor infrastructure. Rough roads, unreliable clean water, and sometimes violence. The housekeepers, waiters, taxi drivers, cooks, and gardeners you meet at the resorts go home to these neighborhoods at the end of their shifts. They are the ones who create paradise for tourists, but they don't get to live in it. The version of Cancun you see in travel magazines never includes these neighborhoods. It doesn't show the dusty roads thousands of workers walk or drive every day to get to their jobs. It doesn't mention the massive challenge of managing the waste generated by a city built on tourism or the pressure on the Yucatan Peninsula's freshwater aquifers. When we package sun, sand, and smiles, we often leave out the complicated, sometimes painful stories sitting just beneath that flawless surface. So selling Latin America as a tourism paradise isn't just a simple marketing campaign. It's a complex process that has built a gigantic, profitable industry, while also sowing the seeds of inequality, environmental destruction, and cultural erosion. Selling Latin America doesn't condemn tourism outright. It invites us to look deeper into the power structures and mechanisms that have shaped an entire region rich in culture and humanity into something that can be consumed in specific, controlled ways. The next time you daydream about escaping to a far-off tropical island, pause for a moment and reflect. We can absolutely enjoy the beauty of this world, but we also carry a responsibility as travelers. Ask yourself, who is really benefiting from my trip? And what can I do to make sure I'm contributing to a more sustainable and fair kind of tourism? That's not an easy question to answer, but it's a necessary one. In the next chapter, we'll shift to another dimension of selling Latin America, the power of imagery and media in shaping Western perceptions. Don't miss it. See you there. Welcome back to the channel where we peel back the layers behind the stories hidden inside the books we read. Today we're diving into a territory that every single one of us has visited at least once: the world of popular culture. This is Chapter 5 in our journey through selling Latin America, a problem in international salesmanship. And it carries a wonderfully evocative title: Popular Culture from Carmen Miranda to Narcos. If in the previous chapters we explored how Western powers sold Latin America as a tourism product or an investment opportunity, then this chapter tackles how Hollywood and global media have packaged and marketed an entire continent, one that is unimaginably diverse. And the truth is, this packaging often creates far more problems than it solves. Let's rewind for a moment back to the 1940s, when a name as bright as the Rio de Janeiro sun rose to global fame, a dazzling yet controversial symbol of Latinness in the eyes of worldwide audiences: Carmen Miranda. You probably remember the image of a woman wearing a massive fruit hat, wrapped in vibrant costumes, dancing energetically with a dazzling smile. That was Carmen Miranda, the Brazilian bombshell who became a sensation in Hollywood. She was a phenomenon, a star, an unofficial cultural ambassador for Latin America, one crafted and exported by Hollywood itself. But here's the problem. The version of culture Carmen Miranda represented was reduced, simplified, and polished to the point of being alarming. It was a mix of a little bit of Brazil, a touch of what Americans imagined Latin exoticism to be, and a whole lot of exaggeration. From her playful English accent to the authentic Latin dances choreographed by Hollywood, everything was engineered to be digestible, easy, and most importantly, non-threatening. She embodied joy, carefree energy, passion, but without depth, without politics, without the social complexities of real Latin American lives. Hollywood saw a golden opportunity to sell an easy, colorful, irresistible version of Latin America. Carmen Miranda became the perfect embodiment of that harmless fantasy, a fun, spicy musical Latina woman who entertained but never challenged. It cemented a stereotype we still see in films and ads today. What do you think? Is that really how the world should understand a culture? Or is it just a cute mask hiding something far more complex? From fruit hats and samba beats, let's jump to the 21st century, where Latin America's global image took a dramatic, even extreme shift. I'm talking about the unstoppable popularity of shows like Narcos: El Chapo and more recently, Griselda. These series, especially Narcos, are undeniably effective at telling gripping high-stakes stories about infamous drug lords. They boast massive budgets, top-tier production, and huge global success. Millions have binge-watched these shows following drug wars, political conspiracies, and relentless violence in Colombia and Mexico. But what's the impact? Put simply, for many viewers around the world and Latin America, especially Colombia and Mexico, has become synonymous with drugs, crime, and violence. Endless coca fields, dangerous slums, and chaotic chase scenes have seared themselves into the global imagination. And this isn't total distortion. Drug trafficking is a serious issue in parts of Latin America. But is it the whole story? Does it reflect everything happening across a continent with hundreds of millions of people? Incredible cultural richness, heroic histories, and immense contributions to the world. Narcos is a wildly successful product, but this product unintentionally or deliberately sells a distorted image of Latin America. It reinforces a new stereotype, no longer just the fun, spicy Latina dancing her way across the screen, but now a region of danger, violence, and criminals. Both versions are oversimplifications, and both erase the true diversity and depth of the region. This leads us to another crucial point: the roles available to Latin American actors in international films and in their own cinematic industries. Think about it. What kinds of roles do you usually see Latin actors playing in Hollywood? Gangsters, drug lords, maids, housekeepers, the hot Latina, the fiery lover, the tragic victim. Roles that come pre-packaged with stereotypes, often shallow, sometimes offensive. For talented Latin actors, this must be incredibly frustrating. They're boxed into a narrow mold Hollywood has built. But what happens when we look at Latin America's own film industries? Everything changes. Watch a movie from Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, or Colombia, and you'll see Latin actors portraying every type of character. University professors, scientists, doctors, hardworking mothers, dedicated fathers, innocent children, factory workers, organizing for justice, wandering artists, complex lovers, or ordinary people navigating life's tragedies. They play multidimensional, deeply human roles that reflect their real societies, not simplified versions tailored to Western tastes. Latin American cinema has produced thousands of brilliant, artistic, profoundly human films. But sadly, they don't always reach global audiences the way Hollywood's drug-themed stories do. What the world gets sold about Latin America is often what Hollywood chooses to sell, not what Latin America wants to say. And this brings us to the biggest question of the chapter. The question I believe lies at the heart of the entire book. When will Hollywood stop reselling the same tired story about Latin America? Honestly, that's not an easy question. Hollywood is an industry. Industries run on profit. Profit comes from formulas that already work. And stories about the hot Latina or the notorious drug lord have their own built-in appeal, their own ready-made market. And let's be real, a certain laziness in seeking fresh narratives. Changing a stereotype deeply rooted in global consciousness takes enormous time and effort. It requires Hollywood creators to take risks on new stories and new perspectives. It demands that audiences actively seek out and support more diverse content. Latin America is the land of literary giants like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende, artistic legends like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, mesmerizing dances like tango and samba, ancient civilizations, scientific contributions, democratic movements, breathtaking landscapes, and billions of everyday stories, rich, complex, emotional, that the world has barely begun to hear. So how can we as viewers push for change? Start with awareness. Question what you're watching. Seek out films and series made by Latin American creators. Listen to stories told by the people who live them. Selling Latin America isn't just a historical study. It's a reminder that our worldview is shaped by what is sold to us. And it's time we demand a better product, one that's honest, multifaceted, and real. Thank you for joining me for this fascinating Chapter 5. Share your thoughts about Carmen Miranda Narcos or Latin American stereotypes you've seen in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the deeper dives coming up in the next chapters. See you next time. Welcome everyone, and welcome to Chapter 6 of our series, where we continue our journey through Selling Latin America, a Problem in International Salesmanship. If in previous chapters we dissected how Latin America was sold, packaged, framed, and marketed through outside eyes by people who were not children of this land, then today the story turns in a completely different direction, one full of inner strength and defiance. Today we're talking about the moment when Latin Americans themselves stood up, grabbed the pen, the camera, and their own voices to tell their story. This isn't just a cultural movement. It's a wave of resistance, a powerful assertion of identity, a battle to reclaim authenticity from the distorted images the outside world tried to impose. T. Corker, Part 1. The Explosion of Literature. The Latin American Boom. Let's start with a bang. Literally, the explosion of the Latin American literary boom in the 1960s and 1970s. Before that, the region's literature was often viewed through a lens of exotic curiosity or dismissed as small local stories with little global impact. It was treated almost like a niche product meant to satisfy Western curiosity rather than be taken seriously as world literature. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, a generation of extraordinary writers emerged and sent a shockwave not just through Latin American literature, but through global culture. Who among us hasn't at least heard the name Gabriel Garcia Marquez write with his masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude? Cien Años de Soledad. He didn't just tell the story of the Buendia family or the fictional town of Macondo. He built an entire universe where magic dissolves into harsh reality, where the tragic history and the wild beauty of the continent are laid bare in all their brutal and breathtaking complexity. This wasn't a book designed to sell Latin America as a tourist attraction or an exotic backdrop. It was an invitation for readers to live inside Latin America, to feel it from the inside, with all its contradictions, its chaos, its heartbreak, and its deadly romance. It reveals a recurring history of violence, love, and broken dreams, but in a voice so hypnotic you can't look away. Alongside Marquez's legendary names, like Julio Cortázar with Hopscotch Rayuela, Mario Vargas Llosa with The Time of the Hero, La Ciudad y los Perros, and Carlos Fuentes with The Death of Artemio Cruz. La Muerte de Artemio Cruz created a global phenomenon. They proved that Latin America was not just poverty and revolutions like the images on the evening news. It was also rich philosophical depth, psychological complexity, and a boundless, imaginative power. They used the written word to challenge the simplistic, one-dimensional images imposed from the outside. They reclaimed the right to define themselves, to speak about their pain, their beauty, and their dreams in their own way, as honestly and vividly as possible. Le Part 2, Cinema of Resistance, Third Cinema. If literature had the boom, then film had third cinema. This was not Hollywood entertainment with huge budgets and glittering movie stars, first cinema. Nor was it European auteur cinema focused on personal style and formal experimentation, second cinema. Third cinema was a film movement born in Latin America in the late 1960s and early 1970s with a clear goal to use film as a revolutionary tool, a weapon against neocolonialism, imperialism, and social oppression. Picture this: no major studios, no carefully trained celebrity actors. Instead, filmmakers with guerrilla-style cameras shooting in slums, remote rural areas, with shoestring budgets, but with intense passion and conviction. They told stories about workers, peasants, injustice, struggles for independence. and the voices that history tried to erase. Their aim wasn't to make money or win awards. Their aim was to awaken political consciousness and inspire action. The classic film, The Hour of the Furnaces, La Hora de los Hornos by Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino from Argentina, is a powerful example. It's a documentary running over 4 hours packed with shocking footage, street interviews, and fierce narration about Latin America's history of exploitation. It's not a film you just watch and forget. It's an experience, a call to action. A raw expose of how Latin America has been exploited and perceived by foreign powers, and it became an icon of resistance. Filmmakers like Glauber Rocha in Brazil developed an aesthetics of hunger, a visual and narrative style built around poverty, not to sensationalize suffering, but to show the resilience and life force of people in the harshest conditions. These works directly challenge the romanticized, exoticized images that Hollywood and Western media loved to project onto Latin America. They turned the screen into more than a place for entertainment. They turned it into a battlefield to reclaim image, reclaim dignity, and demand that their story must be told, and told truthfully. UBART 3, an uncompromising voice, Eduardo Galeano. And when it comes to using art as a political tool, few did it with more force and persistence than Eduardo Galeano. Though not a boom novelist in the strict magical realist sense, his legacy is firmly rooted in this wave of resistance, perhaps even more directly and fiercely. His most iconic work, Open Veins of Latin America. Las Venas Abiertas de America Latina, published in 1971, isn't a novel or a film. It's an indictment, a 500-year-long historical charge sheet. Galeano dug into the continent's history from the moment Columbus arrived, exposing in chilling, unforgettable detail how Latin America's resources, labor, and even its soul were plundered and drained by foreign powers. He argued that Western development was often built on Latin American underdevelopment. Every bar of gold, every ton of silver, every barrel of oil shipped away was another vein cut open, another part of the continent's body bled dry. Galeano didn't hesitate to name the forces that had sold Latin America from the conquistadors chasing gold to the modern multinational corporations. He used facts, history, and a uniquely poetic yet razor-sharp style to tear down the sanitized progress narratives that outsiders wanted us to believe. This was a book banned in multiple countries under military dictatorships, precisely because of its power to shatter official stories and awaken people's consciousness. I remember reading it and feeling as if someone had pulled back a curtain, revealing a completely different way of seeing world history. Galeano didn't just retell history. He forged a spiritual weapon, a source of inspiration for anyone who wants to understand and fight for a more sovereign and just Latin America. He proved that truth itself can be the most powerful form of art and one of the strongest tools we have against imposed narratives. In Part 4, The Power of Self-Narration, Redefining Identity. So why is it so important to tell your own story, not just for Latin America, but for any culture that has ever been defined by someone else? Because this goes far beyond who tells the story better. When you tell your own story, you reclaim the right to define who you are. You are no longer just an object being observed, analyzed, and labeled by others. You become the subject, the one creating meaning for yourself and for your people. For Latin America, this means breaking out of stale stereotypes: the dangerous jungle, the brutal dictator, the fiery but shallow dance, the endless supply of cheap raw materials. It allows the region to show its rich cultural diversity, deep philosophies of life, complex struggles, and relentless hopes. It lets the world see a Latin America that isn't only its scars, but also its enormous heart and unbreakable spirit. Self-narration is an act of liberation, a crucial step in the process of decolonization, not just politically, but spiritually and intellectually. It allows future generations to see themselves in a more honest, more complete light, instead of through the warped mirrors held up by others. It lays the foundation for real dignity and self-respect. Throughout the 20th century and into today, the battle over who gets to tell the story is still going on. The voices of the boom of third cinema of Eduardo Galeano and countless other artists have not only reshaped how the world sees Latin America, more importantly, they've reshaped how Latin America sees itself. This is a powerful reminder that art and culture are not just entertainment. They are some of the most potent tools we have to change perception, build empathy, and fight for justice, for stories that were forgotten or distorted. And that's when we realize no matter how hard others try to sell Latin America through false images, in the end, authenticity when spoken by its own people will always echo louder and last longer. Thank you for listening to Chapter 6. I'll see you in the next chapter where we'll keep digging into even more fascinating dimensions of this book. If in the previous chapters we talked about selling natural resources, or even selling outdated stereotypical images of a wild, impoverished Latin America, then now the market has become much more sophisticated. The world has changed, and the way we sell or are sold Latin America has changed with it. Today we're stepping into Chapter 7, a chapter I believe touches on many of the issues we care about in modern life. The new products, sustainable, handmade, and experiential. These aren't just trendy buzzwords. They're powerful forces reshaping how we interact with the world, especially with a region as rich in culture and ecology as Latin America. Our goal today is to unpack these trends, recognize what's genuinely good about them, while also staying alert to the hidden traps of things like greenwashing and cultural appropriation. Let's start with the word sustainable, a concept that's become the gold standard across countless industries. And when you think of Latin America, what comes to mind first? Exactly coffee. You know that feeling when you're holding a bag of coffee labeled fair trade, organic, grown by indigenous farmers at 5,000 feet in the Andes? Sounds irresistible, right? It's not just a drink anymore. It's a story, an ethical experience. You feel like you're helping improve the lives of farmers, like you're doing your part to protect the environment. Or think of ecotourism. Instead of luxury resorts, you're invited to join an Amazon rainforest journey with local communities, a no-electricity back-to-nature retreat, a return to the wild. Marketing campaigns constantly emphasize how authentic, responsible, and one-of-a-kind these experiences are. We as Western consumers feel like we're doing the right thing, helping connecting with other cultures in a mindful way. But in reality, who benefits the most from this so-called sustainable ethical economy? That's the big question we need to ask. Take a closer look at the fair trade coffee supply chain. I'm not saying it's meaningless. Clearly, it does bring some benefits to farmers compared to traditional markets. However, behind that glossy label lies a complex value chain, with layers of middlemen certification fees and massive marketing budgets. In the end, that $15 bag of coffee in New York might only translate into a few extra cents of profit for a farmer in Colombia or Guatemala. Most of the profit still ends up with big corporations, distributors, and marketing firms in developed countries. Farmers may live a bit better, but systemic change is still painfully slow. The same thing happens with ecotourism. The original concept is beautiful, responsible travel, environmental protection, and benefits for local communities. But how many times have we seen large corporations buy up pristine coastal land, build eco-resorts with spa packages and infinity pools, and then blast out massive ad campaigns? Tourists pay thousands of dollars to immerse themselves in nature, while local people are pushed off their land or hired only for low-wage physical labor. That's exactly what we call greenwashing. A green curtain draped over business-as-usual practices that aren't truly sustainable, just enough to soothe consumer guilt and boost profits. From coffee beans, let's move to handmade goods, items crafted by hand carrying stories, culture, and the spirit of their makers. This can be a beautiful way to connect with Latin American culture, support local artisans, and own something genuinely unique. But this is also where the line becomes thinnest, where we can easily slide into cultural appropriation. There's a huge difference between appreciating a culture and appropriating it. Cultural appreciation is when you genuinely learn, research, honor, and support the people who created that culture. You buy products from the actual artisans. You learn the meaning behind the patterns. You wear or use the item with respect and understanding. For example, you buy a hand-woven necklace from an indigenous woman in Peru, and you know that every bead, every color, carries a deep spiritual meaning for her community. So, what is cultural appropriation? It happens when elements of a culture, often from a marginalized or oppressed group, are taken by a dominant culture and used without understanding, without permission, without respect, and usually for commercial profit or as a passing fashion trend. You might see a famous fashion designer inspired by Aztec patterns for a new collection selling pieces at sky-high prices, without ever acknowledging or compensating the people who created those designs. Or you see white tourists wearing traditional Quechua hats as party costumes without any awareness of their historical and cultural significance. This doesn't just strip the original meaning from the culture, turning it into a hollow accessory or decorative trend. It also steals economic opportunities from the very people who own that culture. It causes harm, erases identity, and sometimes even reinforces old stereotypes. Latin America has endured centuries of having its resources sold off, and now we have to be careful that its culture isn't sold off in the same way. To understand this difference better, let's compare two kinds of projects. A community-led project. Imagine a small community tourism initiative in a remote cloud forest village in Ecuador. The village is owned and run entirely by the local people. They decide how to welcome visitors, what activities to share, and how much to charge. Profits are reinvested into building schools, buying medicine, or funding sustainable agriculture projects. Tourists who come don't just sightsee. They learn about the culture, join in daily life, helping harvest coffee, learning pottery, listening to old stories by the fire. This is a truly authentic experience, where respect and cultural exchange flow in both directions, and the community's well-being is the top priority. They're not turned into performers. They're storytellers and guides proud of their heritage. A superficial project. Now place that next to an eco-tourism package heavily promoted by a multinational company. They build a high-end eco-lodge in the Amazon, with luxury bamboo cabins and an infinity pool overlooking the river. They hire a few local people as tour guides, or to perform traditional dances in the evenings. But all the real power management, marketing, profit distribution sits in a headquarters thousands of miles away. Tourists are brought in and given a carefully curated Hollywood-style version of local culture perfectly tailored to Western expectations. Locals may have jobs, but little voice. Most of the economic benefits flow to investors, not the community. This is selling an experience without truly sharing control, turning their culture into a high-end product that looks authentic but often lacks genuine depth and empowerment. You see labels like sustainable, handmade, experiential sound, beautiful, inspiring, admirable. But we as consumers, travelers, and people who care have to learn how to look past the marketing and ask the hard questions. What is the real origin of this product? Who is in control of creating and sharing this culture? Where does the money actually go? Are my actions truly supporting this community or unintentionally harming it? Latin America is not just a market to be mined. It is a treasure of culture, history, and human experience. It doesn't need us to save it. It needs respect, fairness, and the opportunity to shape its own future. I think that through Chapter 7, we've gained a deeper understanding of how Latin America is being sold in this new era. It's a double-edged sword. On one side, it can open doors to sustainable development and genuine cultural exchange. On the other, it can mask more sophisticated forms of exploitation, dressed up in the language of ethics and responsibility. So let's be thoughtful consumers, responsible travelers, and people who always ask questions. Because only when we truly understand what's going on can we make a real positive difference. Thank you for joining me in today's chapter. Share your thoughts on this topic in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes. See you in the next chapter of Selling Latin America. Welcome back to our series, Decoding Latin America. I'm your host. And today, we're going to open up a completely new chapter 1 that I'm pretty sure will hit close to home for a lot of your own personal experiences. If in earlier chapters we dug into history, politics, economics, and the ways powerful nations or big corporations have sold Latin America in all kinds of forms, from goods and resources to images and culture, then today we're going to ask a different question. In the digital age, who is selling Latin America now? And how is that different from before? Let's step into Chapter 8. The digital age. Who's selling Latin America on social media? In the 21st century, everything has changed at breakneck speed, especially with the explosion of social media. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. They're not just places to connect with friends or kill time anymore. They're massive marketplaces, global stages. Now the seller isn't just a government or a big corporation. It's anyone with a smartphone and a social media account. And the product being sold isn't just something physical. It's experiences, stories, and entire cultures. When you think about Latin America and social media, what pops into your mind first? I'm willing to bet a lot of you picture those viral shots of a flowing maxi dress twirling in front of colonial buildings in Cartagena, or a picture-perfect brunch overlooking the Caribbean, or a TikTok of someone dancing salsa in Colombia. Right? That's the world of travel influencers. 1. Analyzing content trends among foreign travel bloggers, influencers in Latin America. Let's take a moment to really look at what travel influencers, especially those from wealthy countries, are doing when they discover Latin America. What patterns keep showing up? First, there's an obsession with perfect, carefully curated visuals. Everything has to be beautiful aesthetic. Scenes are color-graded, framed in cinematic angles. Plates of food are arranged like art. The goal is to create a scroll-stopping Instagram feed, a TikTok that goes viral. Second, there's the story of discovery and adventure. The influencer often casts themselves as an explorer, finding hidden gems and secret spots they present as if they were the first to stumble upon them, even when that's obviously not true. They talk about escaping the busy modern life to find inner peace, or experiencing something truly local. Though what we see is usually a version of local that has already been shaped and polished to fit Western expectations. Third, there's simplification and generalization. Latin America, a massive continent with more than 30 countries and hundreds of cultures and languages, gets reduced to a handful of recognizable symbols: turquoise beaches, dramatic mountains, colorful markets, fiery dances. We rarely see the more complicated parts: social issues, political struggles, economic realities, or the deep diversity from one country to the next. The region becomes a pretty backdrop for their story, rather than a living space full of real people and real challenges. What they're selling is a version of Latin America that's been filtered, refined, and packaged easy to digest and highly appealing for a global audience dreaming of the perfect vacation. At its core, they're selling a fantasy and idealized experience. 2. Comparing their lens with the content of local creators. So what about local creators? People who actually live and breathe. Latin America every single day. When you start following their channels, you'll notice a completely different world. Instead of perfectly staged photos and carefully choreographed moments, you might see content that feels raw, real, sometimes even rough around the edges. A food blogger in Lima sharing a family recipe, not on a marble countertop in a designer kitchen, but in a small, cozy home kitchen, full of warmth. A community organizer in Medellin documenting daily life and the struggles their neighborhood faces, not just through speeches, but through everyday scenes. A street artist in Mexico City telling the story of their culture through graffiti, not just showing the finished mural, but the whole process, the work, the sweat, the messages hidden in the art. Local creators often bring a much more layered and nuanced perspective. They don't just show surface-level beauty. They talk about history, economic challenges, social issues, and the complexity of identity. They share personal stories, local traditions that haven't been touristified. They show you festivals not as performances for visitors, but as essential rituals woven into spiritual and community life. They're not selling a dream, they're sharing a reality. They're not packaging experiences, they're inviting you into their lives. The biggest difference lies in who controls the narrative. Local people are defining the story of their home on their own terms, not through the lens of outsiders, not distorted by the demands of the tourism industry. They're not just subjects of someone else's content. They're the authors of their own story. 3. Aesthetic altruism. Using images of the poor to build a personal brand. But social media isn't always fair or kind. There's a particularly uncomfortable side of this that I really want you to think about, because it's controversial and, frankly, quite sad. It's something I call aesthetic altruism. You've probably seen it, photos or videos of influencers posing with poor children in rural villages, or with indigenous people in traditional clothing paired with emotional captions about authentic human connection or the beauty of simplicity. Or maybe they join a short volunteer trip, then flood their feeds with photos from that one day of giving back. This is where images of people who are less privileged, often from marginalized communities, are used as props to build someone's personal brand. It's a way to prove visually, look, I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I care. And in doing so, they're effectively selling their goodness, using other people as the backdrop to make themselves look better. Why is this such a problem? First, it's a form of subtle exploitation. Those children, those indigenous elders, those families, they're not props. They're human beings with dignity and their own stories. They don't always have the power to say no or to understand how their image will circulate globally. One-sided photography, especially when there's a clear power imbalance, can strip them of humanity and turn them into scenery for someone else's narrative. Second, it often lacks real depth or commitment. A beautiful photo with a poor child can get thousands of likes and heart emojis. But how often is it accompanied by long-term involvement, a real understanding of the root causes of poverty, or concrete work toward real change? Most of the time, it's performative. It makes the influencer's profile look more soulful and generous, but doesn't actually do much for the people in the photo. I remember reading an analysis of a famous travel blogger who posted a picture with an elderly indigenous woman, her face full of wrinkles, her eyes tired, with a caption about honoring the beauty of simplicity. The problem: the blogger never asked permission, never learned her name, never learned her story. This woman was reduced to an aesthetic symbol to elevate someone else's brand. That's ego dressed up as charity. This is yet another way Latin America, or more precisely the hardest lives in Latin America, continue to be sold. Not in dollars this time, but in likes, shares, and the polished image of someone else's online persona. 4. Inviting the audience to seek out and support authentic voices from the region. So what can we do as viewers and consumers of content to change this game? Actually, a lot. The most important thing is to become intentional, responsible consumers of content. Don't stop at pretty color-graded images. Ask yourself, who is telling this story? Why are they telling it? Do they really understand the place they're talking about? I want to invite you to actively seek out and support authentic voices from Latin America itself. How do you find them? Use local hashtags on Instagram and TikTok, for example. Huaxc Hicho in Mexico. Made in Colombia. Cultura Peruana. Yublanahanan Chile Lindo. Look up YouTube channels run by creators in specific countries. Follow independent journalists, social activists, artists, local chefs. They'll show you perspectives that are far more real, rich, and complex. They'll help you see that Latin America isn't just beaches and ruins. It's people living, working, fighting, dreaming, and telling their own stories. When you interact with content, do it consciously. Leave thoughtful comments. Share content that feels meaningful. And above all, listen. When we do this, we're not just supporting honest creators. We're helping shift how Latin America is seen on a global scale. We help break old stereotypes, challenge those glossy, idealized images, and create space for real stories to emerge. Selling Latin America may have been written long ago, but its message still hits home in the digital age. The real issue isn't just who is selling, but what they're selling and how. And now the power to change how it's sold lies in our hands as content consumers. Let's be responsible viewers. Let's back authenticity. Let's help make sure Latin America isn't just an object being sold, but a subject, a storyteller in its own right. It's quite a journey, isn't it? From old book pages to glowing phone screens, the story of selling Latin America continues, but with new characters and new tools. And I truly believe that with clear eyes and open hearts, we can help shape a future where honesty and respect come first. Thank you for spending time with me on this chapter. Join me in the next one where we'll dive deeper into the future of Latin America in an age of globalization and relentless technological change. If in the previous chapters we dissected how Latin America has been packaged and sold on the international market, shaped by stories written by others, then today we're turning a whole new page, one that I believe will feel incredibly inspiring. This is Chapter 9, Rebranding. A future defined by Latin Americans themselves. And honestly, this might be the part I was looking forward to the most while reading Selling Latin America. A problem in international salesmanship because it's no longer just about analyzing the past. It's about looking ahead. It's about the rise of a continent that is standing taller, defining its own identity, and telling its own story on the global stage beyond the label of product and beyond old, tired stereotypes. Throughout history, Latin America has usually been seen through someone else's lens, from European powers to the United States. They defined the region. They marketed the region in whatever way suited their interests. But right now, a powerful shift is underway. From the buzzing streets of Medellin to the new tech hubs of São Paulo, from art studios in Mexico City to regional economic forums, Latin Americans are actively writing their own chapter in history. So what do those efforts actually look like? Let's take a closer look together. First, we have to talk about the Pan-Latin American initiatives that are taking off across multiple fields. Economically, we're no longer just talking about exporting raw materials. Trade blocs like Mercosur or the Pacific Alliance aren't just names on paper. They're real ongoing efforts to boost intra-regional trade, deepen economic integration, and build a stronger, more unified voice on the global market. Think of it as countries realizing that their power lies in cooperation, creating a massive, diverse internal market where goods and services can move more freely, helping drive innovation and growth. And it doesn't stop there. Tech is bringing in an entirely new wave of change. Did you know that many cities in Latin America are positioning themselves as their own versions of Silicon Valley? From fintech startups in Brazil to software development hubs in Colombia, to advanced biotech in Chile, to AI centers in Mexico. Young founders full of energy and vision are building tech solutions not just for local problems, but for the global market. They're not just importing technology, they're creating it. Culturally, there's a quiet revolution underway. We're no longer just talking about tango or samba, even though, for the record, I love both. Today's Latin America is exporting a much more diverse and layered cultural output. Look at film directors from the region have won major international awards, telling powerful, deeply personal stories about their people and their countries. Look at music. It's not just reggaeton dominating global charts. There's a whole universe of independent genres blending traditional sounds with modern influences that are finding audiences worldwide. Cross-border cultural festivals and collaborative art projects are helping to redefine and enrich the region's image. They're showing the world that Latin America is not some monolithic block, but a multicolored universe where every country, every region, has its own stories worth listening to. Next, let's talk about the individual success stories that are reshaping how the region is perceived. These are young entrepreneurs, emerging artists, and social leaders who are breaking old molds. Picture someone like Mariana in Bogotá, who builds an e-commerce platform dedicated to selling handcrafted goods made by indigenous communities across the region. She's not just creating income for under-recognized artisans. She's bringing their stories and cultural heritage to the world, proving that Latin America's value lies in its uniqueness, its meticulous craftsmanship, and its cultural depth. Or someone like a Carlos in Lima, who develops a mobile app that helps small-scale farmers connect directly with bigger markets, cutting out middlemen and increasing their income. That's not just an app, that's a tool of empowerment, giving people who are often ignored a stronger voice and a more secure economic footing. And then there are artists like Sofia, a young singer-songwriter from Chile, whose music blends Andean folk elements with modern electronic sounds. She's not trying to Europeanize or Americanize herself. She leans into her own identity to create something unique that resonates with global audiences. These are people who aren't waiting for someone else to market their region. They are becoming the ambassadors themselves, the most authentic storytellers of Latin America. They're proving that innovation, creativity, and genuine identity are the most valuable products of all. But to truly rebrand, what does Latin America need most? The answer is regional unity and cooperation. Latin America's history is full of conflict and division, but today, a new spirit of collaboration is emerging. As you know, standing alone, each country can be small and vulnerable. But together, they become a serious force. This unity doesn't just show up in economic blocks. It's also visible in shared experiences, resource pooling, and joint efforts to tackle regional challenges like climate change, social inequality, or cultural preservation. Regional summits, student exchange programs, and joint scientific research projects are becoming more common. Countries are realizing that solving one nation's internal problems can offer valuable lessons to others. The idea of a patria grande, a greater homeland, once a distant ideal of liberators like Simón Bolívar, is slowly being reborn in a new form, not as a single federal superstate, but as a multi-layered network of cooperation where each country keeps its own identity while working together for a more prosperous future for the entire continent. It's a kind of unity built on mutual respect, a shared understanding of common challenges, and a shared vision of a more self-reliant future. So when we look at Latin America today, what do we see? No longer just an emerging market or a land of opportunity waiting to be exploited. We see a continent growing more confident, more self-directed, in the middle of a full-scale rebrand of its own image. Latin America's future isn't some pre-written fate. It's a canvas being painted by Latin Americans themselves with the ink of innovation, the colors of cultural diversity, and the bold strokes of solidarity. They're creating a story that isn't only about economic growth or tech milestones, but about resilience, about the ability to bounce back, about spiritual and emotional depth, and about an identity so complex that it can't be squeezed into any simplistic label. It's a future that is diverse, self-determined, and layered, where indigenous voices are heard, where creativity is celebrated, and where every story has value. It's no longer a product to be sold, but a living, evolving presence, confidently claiming its place in the world. As we close this chapter, I want you to carry one hopeful message with you. Latin America is rising not to imitate anyone else, but to become the truest, strongest version of itself. This is the story of a continent writing its own history with ink made of pride, innovation, and unity. A future that no one can sell off because it already belongs to the people who are creating it. Hello, my curious friends, and welcome back to this journey where we peel back the layers of the global economic system and the stories hiding behind it. Today, we're opening a chapter that is anything but comfortable but absolutely essential in the book Selling Latin America, a problem in international salesmanship, a chapter that, in my opinion, doesn't just apply to Latin America, but to many developing countries around the world that have either gone through this or are going through it right now. We're stepping into Chapter 10, The Debt That Can't Be Paid, The Burden of Rescue Packages. Just hearing that title, you can already feel the contradiction, right? Rescue is supposed to mean relief, salvation. But here, it's tied to burden and can't be paid. So what went wrong? Let's picture it like this. You're in serious financial trouble. Someone shows up, puts a hand on your shoulder, and makes you a very tempting offer. We can help you out of this mess. Just follow our plan, and you'll be prosperous and developed in no time. Sounds amazing, right? But is that promise always true? On the international stage, that someone is usually giant financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. They don't just sell loans. They also sell a vision, a ready-made package of so-called solutions they call structural adjustment programs, SAPs. When a developing country faces a debt crisis or needs money to modernize and develop, the IMF and World Bank step in. They offer huge loans wrapped in very strict conditions. They say things like, "This is how you stabilize your economy, attract foreign investment, and integrate into the global market." It sounds logical. It sounds promising. Who wouldn't want stability and growth? But have you ever stopped to ask, what exactly are those conditions, and why? After decades of these programs, are so many countries still drowning in debt, while their people are still struggling to survive? The answer lies in what we often call austerity. In everyday language, you could think of it as tightening your belt. In economic policy, it means cutting spending to the bone. At first glance, cut spending sounds simple. We're short on money, so let's spend less. But when spend less is imposed on an entire country from the outside, it takes on a whole different meaning. It's not just about canceling a vacation or skipping a new TV. No, in this context, austerity means things like cutting public spending on healthcare, education, social programs, even pensions, privatizing state-owned companies, selling off essential public assets, sometimes at bargain prices, to private corporations, often foreign, raising taxes, especially consumption taxes, which hit regular people the hardest, opening up the market, slashing trade barriers, and letting foreign goods flood in, sometimes wiping out young domestic industries before they even have a chance to grow. And here's where it really hurts, the impact of these policies on everyday people. I remember reading story after story from researchers and from people living in countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, where these rescue packages were rolled out. Imagine a mother in a small rural town. Her child has a high fever. Before she could take her kid to a public clinic or hospital where care was affordable or even free. But now, because of austerity measures, the hospital has laid off. Staff medicine is in short supply. And on top of that, they've started charging user fees. What might be a small fee for someone in a big city is a fortune for a poor farming family. She has to choose leave her child at home and hope the fever breaks, or go into debt just to get basic medical care that might not even be fully available. The health of a child, the well-being of an entire community ends up on the scale with a set of numbers in some financial report. Or take education. In some countries, to save money, governments fired thousands of teachers. Schools that were already under-resourced became even more hollowed out. Kids who should have had a shot at a better future through education were simply shut out. We love to say investing in education is investing in the future. But these policies, in the name of fiscal discipline, are literally stripping away that future from an entire generation. These aren't isolated stories. They are the direct result of cutting budgets for healthcare, education, and social safety nets so the country can save money, pay its debt, and hit financial targets set by the IMF or World Bank. And all of this is sold under a very appealing narrative: modernization and development. We're told these loans will help build modern infrastructure, attract foreign capital, create jobs, and pull the country out of backwardness. We're shown a glossy picture of a prosperous future where everyone can enjoy a lifestyle that looks more like what you'd see in wealthy countries. Take this bitter medicine now, they say, and you'll enjoy a sweet future later. But reality is often much harsher. Modernization frequently ends up meaning that multinational corporations get access to a country's natural resources at cheap prices, or that major infrastructure projects are built by foreign companies using foreign contractors with profits flowing out of the country instead of staying in. Development becomes an empty buzzword when the health indicators are getting worse, dropout rates are rising, and inequality is increasing. Ordinary people don't feel this development in their day-to-day lives. What they feel is a heavier debt burden and a life that keeps getting harder. So a crucial question rises to the surface. Who actually benefits from these massive loans? It's definitely not the mothers choosing between food and medicine. Not the kids who can't go to school. First, a big chunk of these loans is often used just to pay off old loans. The money doesn't necessarily go into building new industries or improving people's lives. It just spins around the global financial system, moving from one creditor to another. And who are those creditors? Mostly banks and financial institutions in wealthy countries. So you end up with a poor country borrowing money to pay a rich country at interest under terms created by the rich countries. Second, when state assets are privatized, who snaps them up? Very often it's huge foreign companies or local elites with close ties to those in power. They buy up electricity, water, telecom systems on the cheap, then make huge profits providing essential services back to the public. Third, there are the consultants, advisors, and officials from those same international financial institutions. They get high salaries, fly business class, stay in luxury hotels, and oversee the implementation of structural adjustment programs. Meanwhile, people in the borrowing countries are tightening their belts just to get by. So this huge mountain of rescue debt ends up functioning as a tool to maintain and strengthen a global economic order, where some countries are almost always the lenders and others are almost always the borrowers with very limited control over their own destiny. This debt trap is a vicious cycle. A country borrows money, adopts austerity measures, the economy slows, people get poorer, society becomes unstable. To fix the crisis, it needs more money, so it borrows again under similar conditions. Round and round it goes. Economic sovereignty gets chipped away bit by bit. Decisions about the country's future no longer fully rest with its own government or its own people. So, yes, Chapter 10, The Debt That Can't Be Paid, is more than just a chapter in a book. It's a vivid, painful portrait of how promises of development and modernization can morph into a crushing burden for millions of people. It's a reminder that behind GDP growth rates and upbeat economic reports, there are real lives, real families bearing the consequences. When we talk about selling Latin America, we're not just talking about selling products or raw materials. We're also talking about selling an entire development model, an entire vision of the future one, where the price tag ends up being way too high and deeply unfair. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this: we need to examine every solution from multiple angles. We need to put people, not just balance sheets, at the center of every policy. And we must keep asking the hard questions. Who really benefits and who is paying the price? I hope that our deep dive into selling Latin America, a problem in international salesmanship, has sparked a lot of thoughts in you. We've taken apart old stereotypes and outdated approaches that once shaped how cultures saw and treated each other. But as always, once we understand the problem, the most important thing is, what do we do next? Because, my friends, changing a lens you've been wearing for years isn't something that happens overnight. It's a journey. It takes intention. It takes repetition. And that's exactly why today I want to kick off with you a 7-day action plan, changing your lens. This isn't some hardcore challenge or an expensive project. It's simply an invitation for you to open your heart, open your mind, and let a fresh breeze from Latin American culture blow through your worldview. Our goal is very clear: to break down unconscious biases and to start engaging with Latin American culture in a deeper, more respectful, and more responsible way. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Day 1 and Day 2. Dive into the arts, film and music. Let's start this journey with 2 forms of art that have a special power to move the human soul: cinema and music. Day 1, watch a film by a Latin American director. I want you to actually set aside some time, sit down, turn off all distractions, and let a story from Latin America pull you in. Why film? Because cinema is one of the best windows into everyday life, history, social struggles, and the dreams of people in a place that might feel far away from your own. You might pick a film by a well-known director like Alfonso Cuarón, Mexico, with Roma, to feel the quiet, intimate rhythms of a family's life. Or Guillermo del Toro, also from Mexico, with Pan's Labyrinth, if you want to wander through a dark fairy tale woven into brutal history. Or Pablo Larraín, Chile, with Neruda, to explore the complex portrait of a poet and a nation. When you watch, don't just watch like a passive viewer. Ask yourself, what story is this movie really telling? What are these characters up against? What feels specific or unique about the culture in this film? How is this different from what I used to imagine about Latin America? The first time I watched Amores Perros by Alejandro González Iñárritu, Mexico, I was honestly stunned. It was raw, messy, painfully real. It forced me to think deeply about lives crossing paths in ways I'd never considered before. That's the power of cinema. It makes you ask questions. Day 2, listen to a full album by a Latin American artist. From the big screen, we move into music. The language of the heart, the one that doesn't need translation to hit you. Find an artist from Latin America that you've never listened to before. It could be romantic boleros from Cuba, energetic salsa from Puerto Rico, hypnotic cumbia from Colombia, or the powerful history-soaked songs of Mercedes Sosa from Argentina. When I first discovered Fito Páez, a rock artist from Argentina, I was honestly surprised. I used to think Latin music was all about dancing and upbeat rhythms. But Fito brought poetic lyrics, emotional ballads, a rebellious edge, and a whole universe of feelings I wasn't expecting. Music can be a powerful bridge into people's emotions, their worries, their hopes, their resilience, their joys, and their grief. Let the songs tell you their story. You might not understand every word, but you'll feel the spirit. Day 3 and Day 4, expand your network. Connect directly. After saturating yourself with feeling through art, it's time to step into the real world and hear from real voices. Day 3 and 4. Follow 5 journalists, activists, or content creators from Latin America on social media. This is a crucial step in breaking out of the one-sided lens of mainstream Western media. Instead of only reading about Latin America through headlines written elsewhere, seek out voices from within the region. Go on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. Look for people who tell their own stories, are fighting for a cause, share daily life food history, or simply document the ordinary moments of their reality. You might follow investigative journalists exposing corruption in Mexico, an activist defending indigenous rights in the Amazon, a young chef reinventing Peruvian cuisine, a street artist showcasing Colombian culture through murals, or a young documentary filmmaker talking about social issues in their hometown. Pay attention to what they talk about, what they care about, how they speak to and with their communities. You'll start to see a world that's far more diverse, complex, and vibrant than the simplified image that often appears in foreign news. I once followed a group of young journalists in El Salvador who reported on social issues major outlets barely mentioned. Those first-hand perspectives didn't just give me more information, they helped me feel with people, not just read about them. Open your mind and listen to stories told from the inside. And if you interact, do it with respect. Day 5 and Day 6. Responsible economics. Support local-owned brands. We've watched, we've listened, we've read. Now it's time to turn that awareness into concrete economic action. Day 5 and the 6, research and buy one product, coffee crafts, etc. from a Latin American-owned brand. This is not just shopping. This is intentional support. Many Latin American countries are powerhouse producers of agriculture and handmade goods. Instead of defaulting to generic mass-market products, take some time to look for small brands, family businesses, co-ops owned and run by local communities. You might buy coffee from a small farm in Colombia or Costa Rica, chocolate from Ecuador or Peru, hand-woven textiles from Guatemala or Mexico, or skincare products made with local ingredients. What matters is that you do a bit of homework and make sure you're really supporting a Latin American-owned business that operates in a fair and sustainable way. For example, when I look for coffee, I don't just stare at the logo. I try to dig into the story behind it. Who are the farmers? How do they grow it? Are they getting paid fairly? There's something different about sipping a really good cup of coffee, knowing it came from the hard work and passion of a family in a mountain village somewhere in the Andes. It's not just flavor anymore. It's story. It's connection. This kind of action doesn't just help the local economy directly. It also teaches you about skill tradition and the value of labor in the region. Day 7. Reflect and share. Lock in the shift. We've gone through 6 days of rich experiences. Now it's time to pause, reflect, and let the change sink in. Day 7. Write down 3 stereotypes you've shifted and share one thing you learned with a friend. This is the key step to anchor your new perspective. Grab a notebook, an app, a sticky note, whatever works for you. 1. Write down 3 stereotypes you used to have about Latin America and how they changed over the last 6 days. Maybe you used to see the region mostly through the lens of poverty or violence, and now you've seen stories of resilience, creativity, and joy. Maybe you thought of the music or food in a one-dimensional way, and now you've ventured into much deeper, more varied territory. Maybe your mental image of Latin American people was very narrow. And now you're seeing the massive diversity in ethnicity, class politics, lifestyles, and perspectives. Be honest with yourself. Naming those old stereotypes and recognizing how they shifted is a powerful way to rewire your thinking. 2. Pick one thing you learned this week, whether from a movie, a song, a journalist, or a product you bought, and share it with a friend. Tell them the story, share how it made you feel, or invite them to watch, listen to, or try it with you. Sharing isn't just about teaching others. It helps you reinforce what you've learned. It turns knowledge into conversation, and sometimes it sparks curiosity in someone else and starts a whole new cycle of discovery. I remember how excited I was to tell a friend about a podcast from Chile I had listened to. It wasn't just about the content. It forced me to rethink how the media often portrays protests and social movements. The change doesn't stop with you. It can ripple outward. My friends, this 7-day journey may just be a small dot on the giant map of cultural understanding, but it's a start. It reminds us that if we really want to sell an idea, a product, or a culture, we can't lean on outdated stereotypes. We need empathy. We need respect. We need a genuine desire to understand. Selling Latin America exposed a lot of the mistakes of the past. This 7-day action plan is our roadmap to help build a future where mutual understanding and respect are the foundation. And here's the thing, this isn't just about Latin America. You can use the exact same mindset, curious, open, and responsible with any culture you want to learn about. So start your journey. Change your lens. You'll see that the world suddenly becomes bigger, richer, and so much more meaningful. Thank you for walking through this video with me. Don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment below about your own 7-day experience. I'd really love to hear what you discovered and which stereotypes started to shift inside you. If you've just spent a full 125 minutes with me walking through Selling Latin America, a Problem in International Salesmanship, a title that sounds pretty academic, but actually opens up a ton of questions, then this is the moment where we start distilling things down. I know big ideas and deep analysis can easily get lost in the constant stream of information we consume every day. So in this part, my goal is simple: to boil everything down into 3 key lessons easy to remember that I truly believe we can carry with us and apply to the way we see the world and communicate every single day. This isn't just a regular summary. These are the little gems of insight I picked up from the book, and I hope they'll be just as valuable for you. Let's jump in. Lesson 1. Images are never neutral. The way a place is portrayed always serves some purpose. Sounds obvious, right? But let's push a little deeper. All throughout history, and especially in the context of selling Latin America, you can clearly see that shaping the image of a region, a country, or even a community has never been some innocent objective act. Think back to how Western powers have portrayed Latin America. At certain points, it's been painted as a wild, untamed, dangerous space, a land of savages, uncontrollable jungles, and brutal dictatorships. Those images, even when they seem negative, served a purpose. They justified the so-called civilizing mission. They made it easier to argue that bringing civilization to this backward land was necessary, which just happened to clear the way for resource extraction and political control. Then at other times, especially in the modern era of mass tourism and global commerce, Latin America gets flipped into the exact opposite: a tropical paradise, a land of endless beaches, colorful festivals, sensual dances, and exotic cultures. Those bright, positive images serve a different purpose. They help the tourism industry, multinational companies, and investors sell products, services, and experiences. Latin America becomes a neatly packaged product that's easy to market to the world. See the pattern? Whether the image is negative or positive, harsh or dreamy, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's the result of a deliberate construction process designed to create a specific story, a specific narrative. And every narrative has a storyteller, and every storyteller has a goal. It might be to sell something, justify a political move, attract investment, or reinforce a stereotype that already exists. This teaches us a crucial kind of awareness in the modern world, where we're constantly bombarded with images and stories from every direction. When you read an article, watch a news clip, or scroll past a photo on social media about some place, whether it's a far-off country or the neighborhood down the street, pause for a second and ask, who's telling this story? From what angle did they choose to show this? And what do they want me to believe? Recognizing that images are never neutral is the first step toward becoming a smarter consumer of information, and just as important, toward not becoming an unthinking amplifier for someone else's agenda. It helps us look past the surface and get closer to what's really going on underneath. Lesson 2. Oversimplifying is a form of erasure. When we stuff complex cultures into simple stereotypes, we strip away their humanity and their history. This second lesson is probably one of the most unsettling things I was left with after working through the book. Selling Latin America lays bare how an entire continent, massive, wildly diverse, full of internal contradictions, has been repeatedly packaged into a handful of easy cliches. Think about it. You've got a region with dozens of countries. Each one has centuries of history, unique indigenous cultures, layers of migration, countless languages, religions, customs, and social structures. From the Andes, where ancient civilizations rose and fell, to the Amazon with its ecosystems and indigenous communities, to hyper-modern cities like São Paulo or Buenos Aires, to small towns still carrying the scars of colonial time. It's a gigantic, messy living mosaic. And yet, in a lot of outside eyes, Latin America often gets boiled down to a few predictable images. Salsa and samba coffee plantations, shantytowns or worse drug cartels, crime and endless political chaos. When that's all we see, what are we actually doing? We're erasing the fullness of the people who live there. We're flattening out their stories, their struggles, their achievements, and their contradictions into something simple and convenient. That kind of simplification isn't just a harmless misunderstanding. It's a form of erasure. It strips away the individuality of real people, real communities, real histories. It turns a living, breathing, multidimensional group of human beings into cardboard cutouts. Easy to label, easy to judge, easy to manipulate. When we only see the Mexican, the Brazilian, the Colombian through pre-loaded cliches, we're ignoring billions of unique experiences and identities that don't fit that mold at all. This is a huge lesson for our time when information moves at lightning speed, and stereotypes can harden with just a few viral posts. It reminds us of our responsibility when engaging with any culture or community that isn't our own. Instead of accepting the label that's handed to us, we need to look for depth, nuance, and context, and resist the temptation to reduce everything just because it's easier. Oversimplification doesn't just impoverish our understanding of the world. It actively harms the people being reduced. It builds invisible walls that block genuine understanding, empathy, and connection. And in the end, it keeps us stuck in a world full of prejudice instead of one that honors complexity and difference. Lesson 3. The power to tell your own story is power. Empowering local voices is key to any real understanding. So if images are never neutral and simplification is a kind of erasure, what's the way forward? The third lesson Selling Latin America points to, and the one that personally hits me the hardest, is this. The right to tell your own story is a form of power. Empowering local voices is the key to real understanding. For decades, honestly for centuries, the story of Latin America has been told mostly by outsiders. Explorers, missionaries, investors, foreign journalists, academics from the global north. They shaped how the world sees the region, often through the lenses of profit prejudice, or a very narrow idea of what progress and civilization look like. But what happens when we start listening to the people who actually live there? The ones who grew up inside those cultures, who carry those histories in their families, in their bodies, in their daily lives. The story changes dramatically. They don't just talk about chaos or opportunity. They talk about traditions passed down over millennia, about fights to protect land and identity, about love stories, sacrifices, humor, joy, trauma, resistance, so many things no news headline can ever capture. Selling Latin America quietly suggests that if we truly want to sell Latin America in any fair or sustainable sense, whether we're talking about products, ideas, partnerships, or simply mutual respect, we have to start by listening to the stories from the inside. We have to allow people there to define themselves, to describe their own realities, to share their own contradictions and truths. When local voices are given space and power, they don't just offer a more accurate picture of their home. They're also being recognized as fully human, as subjects, not objects. It's the only way to break old stereotypes and long-standing narratives that have been baked into global consciousness. That's how you build bridges of understanding instead of keeping walls of misunderstanding in place. And in our world today, with digital media and online platforms everywhere, this has never been more possible. We can access podcasts, newsletters, Instagram accounts, YouTube channels, independent projects, run by people on the ground. We can choose to seek them out. We can choose to listen. That's our role, to look for these voices, to support the platforms that amplify them, and most importantly, to listen with an open mind and an empathetic heart. This is a lesson about power, autonomy, and equality. It's about recognizing that every community has just as much right as anyone else to shape how the world sees them. Only when storytelling power is shared, when we truly hand the mic back, can we move toward a world where understanding isn't some problem to be fixed, but a reality we actually live in. So here they are, the 3 core lessons I've pulled out of Selling Latin America. A problem in international salesmanship, and from everything we've unpacked together. 1. Images are never neutral. The way a place is portrayed always serves some purpose. 2. Oversimplification is a form of erasure. When we squeeze complex cultures into simple boxes, we strip away their humanity and their history. 3. The power to tell your own story is power. Empowering local voices is the key to real understanding. My hope is that from a book that seems on the surface very specific about marketing and regional history, we've pulled out lessons that are universal. Lessons that apply to how we see the world, how we process information, and how we treat each other. Take these with you, and I really believe you'll start to look at every story, every headline, every image with sharper eyes, a more open heart, and a stronger sense of responsibility. So we've just taken a deep dive into Selling Latin America, a Problem in International Salesmanship, a book hardly anyone has heard of, yet one that opens up an entire universe of questions about how we shape and are shaped by the stories and images we consume. This journey wasn't just about dissecting an old book. It was a reminder, one directed at all of us, about how we read, how we watch, and more importantly, how we consume culture with intention. And that brings me to a question I want to ask you, the ones who stayed with me all the way to this very moment. I want you to be honest with yourself, and if you're comfortable, be honest with our whole community. What was the biggest preconception you had about Latin America before watching this video, or even before you began taking this region seriously? And what, if anything, has shifted that belief even just a little? Share your thoughts down in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your story. I've had my own preconceptions because, honestly, who doesn't? And it's books like this, the films I've watched, the stories I've been lucky enough to come across that slowly helped me break them down. Confronting what we once believed to be true is never easy, but it's a crucial part of growing up, of expanding our worldview. It reminds us that the world is so much bigger than the tiny window we've been looking through. As Selling Latin America shows us, the way we sell and buy the image of a culture has a massive impact. It shapes not just how we see others, it shapes how we interact with them, how we build policies, and even how we understand our own place in the world. Becoming a conscious consumer of culture isn't just about reading more or watching more. It's about asking questions. Who's telling this story? Why are they telling it? What perspectives are missing? It means stepping outside the comfort zone of what feels familiar, listening to voices that challenge us, and allowing our worldview to stretch. It means realizing that every movie, every article, every story we take in comes through a particular lens, and our job is to recognize that lens so we're not blindly carried along by it. And if this exploration was meaningful for you, if you want to keep digging into hidden histories, overlooked narratives, and underrepresented perspectives from all over the world, not just Latin America, but Asia, Africa, Europe, and every corner in between, then don't hesitate to hit subscribe. We have so much more to uncover together. And don't forget to tap that notification bell so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Every video is a new doorway, an invitation to learn, to question, and to grow. Every video we make is an invitation to a deeper conversation. If you found this meaningful, if you think it might spark something for someone you care about, a friend, a family member, or anyone searching for a deeper way to understand the world, share this video with them. Sharing is how we spread knowledge, curiosity, and understanding. Let's build a community of people who want to see the world in its full complexity. And by the way, learning doesn't end with a single video or a single book. To help you keep exploring Latin America, the power of narrative, and the way we perceive cultures, I've added a list of extra resources in the description, other eye-opening books, documentaries that made me pause and reflect, and even some YouTube channels I think you'll enjoy. Take some time to check them out. Who knows, you might stumble onto a brand new passion, a new lens through which to explore the world. Sometimes the best gems are hidden in the places we least expect. Becoming a conscious consumer of culture isn't a destination, it's an ongoing journey. It demands curiosity, openness, and above all, the courage to question what we think we know, what we're sold every day. It asks us to take a step back, observe, and ask ourselves, what else is out there that I don't see yet? What perspective have I never considered? And I believe every single one of us is capable of asking those questions. So let's keep walking this path together, with wide open eyes, a hungry mind, and a willingness to challenge old assumptions. Thank you so much for joining me on today's journey. I'll see you in the next video.